A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Another federal election on the way, getting closer every day. Might not have a date yet, but our focus is turning again to the policies of the major parties and whether there are any commitments to proactively maintain our freedoms. Well, as a context and all of the other distractions that take people away from thinking about our freedoms, political commentators are talking about Australia and looking like it's lost in a world moving too fast. Defined by strategic danger, just think Chinese warships. Deepening economic competition, just think tariffs in the US. Technological upheaval, just think AI, and unresolved issues around government spending influencing our economy. Well, amidst all of that are the issues of our freedoms, like freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, our religious freedom. Not to mention academic freedom and freedom of political communication. And of course, the risk to Christian schools losing their distinctive faith foundations is back in focus. And there are no commitments from either side to be proactive on issues like religious freedom. Well, Mike Southon is back with us. He's Executive Director of Freedom for Faith, Activating the Church. Do you know who that is? It's you and it's me. Activating the church to defend religious freedom. Mike, a special welcome back to 2020.
Thanks so much, Neil. It's great to be back.
Mike, let's start. First of all, I think, just talking about the Western Australian state election that was held on the weekend. It might be a good place to start. We want to talk federal issues and freedoms and things like that. But I wonder if you've got any perception as to what it means that there was, obviously a drubbing of the Conservative side, the Liberals and the Nationals in WA, a very, very strong showing for the ALP, and, almost absolute power for the ALP in Western Australia. Lost a little bit of shine off their absolute power from the earlier election. But what were your thoughts on the Western Australian state election?
I was a little surprised. I did think that the swing against Labor was going to be bigger than it was. I think most of us did. And it does show that the Labor government has managed to, as you said, keep a lot of its shine from the past 4 years. The Labor government in Western Australia has so far avoided making some of the mistakes that, for instance, the Victorian government has made when it's been in complete power, where we wait and see what they're going to do with their next 4 years. The upper house is going to be a beast for them to manage, but the real fear is that they don't have a majority in the upper house, but with Labor and the Greens put together, they do. But then we start talking about the problems of a Labor-Greens coalition.
Labor-Greens coalition, and that's one of the risks. I'll get your impression as we get our conversation into a little more deeply around our freedoms. Let's talk about the next federal election. Everyone's been anticipating that, the Prime Minister is going to call an election day sometime soon. He was planning to do that apparently on the weekend, but then used the cyclone in Queensland as a reason not to. And maybe he was just waiting to see what would happen with the WA state election. What are your thoughts for the next election date? These things are starting to narrow.
Well, look, if I was Albanese waiting to see the WA results, I definitely would have been announcing straight after that election. I think it would have been it would have been foolishness and very insensitive to call the election while half of Brisbane was underwater, and so he had no choice. When's the date going to be? Well, it's going to have to be mid-May. Because the way that the election system works is he's got to call the election at least 33 days ahead of the vote. And if he calls it tomorrow, he's going to be dropping the election in the middle of Easter or Anzac Day or a whole lot of other things. And so really we're looking at a date. My money is on May 17, but I think there's a possibility of May 10. anything outside of that, I think it's highly unlikely.
And when the election is pushed back to May, there are budget considerations because the federal budget typically handed down in late March. And if there had been an election called last weekend, then they might have avoided having to have a budget. But any thoughts here around the fact that they will need to deliver a budget? And lots of commentators are saying it's going to have a lot of red in it that might not look so good for Labor.
Yes, after 2 surpluses, they're now going to have to be delivering a deficit. But and this is why everybody was expecting the election to be announced for an April 12 election to avoid the budget. I'm sure they had contingencies, but it will be very interesting to see if Labor come out and have a classic pre-election budget, throw money everywhere, have big spending promises. I mean, both parties do it. The budget before an election. So it will be interesting to see if Labor come out big spending or try to tell the story that they've got the fiscal discipline and can cut back on their spending. My guess is they're going to come out. They've already made some very big promises around Medicare and other expenses. We'll see if they can manage to balance those costs.
And big promises around Medicare, to which the opposition almost instantly said, we'll match that and do better. So when we talk big spending, there's a sense here in which, if we're thinking about both sides, they're likely to be both sides big spenders, aren't they?
There really isn't a small spending party in Australia anymore. Peter Dutton is making promises about cutting down the public service. I mean, the first thing that does is it creates unemployment, so he's going to have to figure out how he balances that. So I think Liberals will end up spending less money than Labor, but whether it's really going to be the question of where should the money be spent? Not are you a big spender or not, but should the money be spent on this issue or on that issue? And you've got to make some difficult choices. As you said earlier, defence is going to be a huge expense that's coming. How are we going to be budgeting for that while dealing with Medicare, while dealing with the NDIS and the other things that Australians have come to expect out of our government?
Some are perhaps even thinking there's a lot of looming crises on our horizon. And I mentioned in the introduction just a short while ago, in fact, some words from Paul Kelly, the journalist for The Australian, who said, lost in a world moving too fast, defined by strategic danger, deepening economic competition, technological upheaval, and unresolved issues around government spending influencing our economy. There's a lot of things to distract us from the thoughts of talking about freedoms. But where do you see freedoms in the mix of all of that and how that might affect each of us individually and certainly as a Christian community?
Well, I mean, I think fundamentally freedoms are the question underlying a lot of these crises that you're talking about. The political upheavals that we're seeing, we're seeing big countries, highly militarized countries who don't have the same views of individual freedoms that we do, exercising their muscles very close to our shores. We're seeing AI, which is eating up all our personal data and spitting it out so that big companies know far more about us than we ever thought possible, and more are able to use that data to manipulate us, to shape us, to push us in certain directions. So these issues are really fundamentally issues of our freedoms. How are we going to be living in the next decade? Who is going to be controlling what we can say, what can we do? Or are we going to actually be free to live out our lives and live out our faith?
Maybe we need to add another freedom to that list that I mentioned, the freedom from the control of the manipulation of artificial intelligence. Might be one of those, might be a new freedom. I mean, who's fighting for our freedom from the sort of manipulation that can come from global ideologies in all of that? Hey, I want to ask you, and I'll be direct here, when you've got the likely possibility of a Labor, Greens, Teals power sharing arrangement for the next government, there are going to be listeners who are saying, well, that doesn't bode well for religious freedoms, for Christian schools. What's your perspective on that? I mean, will hopes be dashed if there is a Labor win? Is there any hope on the side of the Conservatives? But how do you see things, Mike?
Yeah, when you talk about the two major parties, Labor and Liberal, when it comes to issues on religious freedom, there's actually really not a lot to draw a line between. We'll probably talk about this later, but Anthony Albanese has made some small promises in writing to faith-based schools and faith communities. Peter Dutton hasn't made any such commitments. There is an expectation that the Liberals aren't going to do anything silly with our religious freedom. But in both cases, whoever's making up a minority government, it's going to be who they're in partnership with, whether it's the Liberals dealing with the Teals or whether it's a Labor dealing with the Greens. Both the Teals and the Greens, neither of them have come out and been very vocal as being friends of religious freedom. And in particular, the Greens have got active policies that are a massive threat to religious freedom. In the name of anti-discrimination, in the name of protecting the LGBTIQ community in particular, they are advocating policies that would prevent faith-based organisations from being able to operate according to their faith, could well prevent individuals from saying what they believe about matters of sexuality and gender and things like that. So the Greens in particular have got very concerning policies. The question is going to be, if Labor does get in power, if Labor does need to look to the Greens for passing legislation, what things are they going to trade? And the way that we can protect ourselves, I could say, against Labor trading off religious freedoms to be able to get some housing package through or something like that, is to be getting both major parties to be making explicit verbal commitments and written commitments saying, no, we understand religious freedom is important, we will protect it, because both parties are going to be making trades from here on in. Both parties are going to be trying to figure out what they're going to give away so they could get their major policies through. However, both parties have shown a general indication that if they've made a promise, if they've made a commitment, they're very unwilling to break that promise. This is going to be the one protection that we can see is getting both parties to bid for us, to say clearly, this is what we're going to be doing for faith communities.
Helping you make sense of life, culture and current events from a biblical perspective. 2020 on Vision.
Our talkback line is open on 1800 316 316. Maybe you've never even heard a conversation like this before and you'd like to get in and have your two bobs worth. You can. 1800 316 316. Our special guest is Mike Southon. Mike is the Executive Director of Freedom for Faith. And I'll mention their website a time or two through our conversation so you can connect with Freedom for Faith, because so much good resource that you'll find when you connect with them and the sorts of initiatives they've got. freedomforfaith.org.au. And just before we get into some more controversial things, Freedom for Faith's been very active with Meet the Candidate forums. And I'll get your thoughts here, Mike, because you've had Meet the Candidate forums in Western Australia, informing people so that people get to actually ask the candidates directly what they think. And you've got lots of these planned for the federal election. Just give us a little explanation how they work.
Yeah, so the candidate forum, it's for the churches, by the churches. Local churches and each electorate are going to hold an event where all the Christians in the electorate are welcome to come. We'll invite the major candidates for that electorate and ask them some questions. It's not about preferring one party over the other or telling people how to vote or who to vote for. It's actually about Christians having the opportunity to hear from their candidates about issues that particularly matter to them. So we've got 65, almost 70 electorates across Australia where one of these is planned. And we still have churches and other electorates contacting us saying of these as well. So it's a real opportunity for you to go to your local church, hear your local candidates and ask them questions about the things you care about.
We'll talk some more about those things. 1800 316 316 to join in our conversation. 1800 316 316. Let's take a call. Philip is in Albany in WA. Hey, Philip, welcome along.
Good morning. So my question is actually in relation to the integrity of the electoral process. Most recently in Western Australia, there was a Labor identity who organised a mass citizenship campaign, and I believe under Australian law, of course, an Australian citizen is entitled to vote, even though they're not on the electoral roll. So my question is whether those 3,500 people, citizens of no fixed address, voted in marginal electorates, potentially altering the outcome of the election in those seats. So that's my question.
Philip, it comes down to one of those things, doesn't it? One side's wonderful initiative becomes the other side's, major issue around integrity of an electoral process. Did you have a thought on that, Mike?
I mean, the mechanical answer is you can't vote just by being a citizen. You do have to be on the roll, but you have to be on the roll within a week of the election being called. The election hasn't been called yet. So those people who became citizens, 3,500, my understanding is that they had an opportunity to get their name on the electoral roll at the citizenship events. That's just from reading the news and a couple of contacts. That's what I understand has happened. So yes, they will most likely be voting. And from where those events were held, a number of them will appear to be in quite marginal seats in New South Wales. It's not a good look, but your other problem is the election's actually not for another month or so away. So it would have been possibly a worse look to have held off making them citizens for another month or two until the election's gone. So it's kind of hard to argue which one would look worse.
Philip, anything further to add?
Look, I just hope that the political processes, reviewing the election, actually examine and tell the public, especially in those marginal electorates, whether the outcome was materially affected by votes brought into those electorates. So hopefully we'll get answers to those questions.
And if it didn't affect WA, then there might be some flow-on effect that might come to the federal election. But Philip, thanks so much for your call. Our talkback line is open on 1-800 316 316. Let's come back to freedoms. I mentioned as we introduced our conversation that Christian schools are back in the firing line because outcomes at the election may well affect whether Christian schools can actually operate according to their ethos, the employment of staff, all of those sorts of things. Is there a worst case scenario that we can talk about? If religious freedoms are under threat, if all of the freedoms that we talk about, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, academic freedom, freedom of political communication, all of these freedoms, they're all freedoms and they come under threat. And is there any sort of worst case scenario that can come to mind for you?
Yeah, two different scenarios jump to mind. The first is that a Labor Party comes to power with a very weak minority and is highly dependent on particularly the Greens. And having come to power, they haven't made any commitments to faith-based schools. And so there's nothing on their platform to say, we promise that we're going to be looking after faith-based schools. And then the horse trading starts, as it inevitably will. And the Greens say, well, this is our requirement for you to pass your housing or your whatever major policies, is that we change the rules around faith-based schools. I'll make it clear what the rules are that we're talking about. At the moment, faith-based schools have got exemption from discrimination law so that they can say, we want to employ people who live out or at least uphold the faith of the school. And normally that's not a problem, but of course the conflict comes when you start talking about the faith of the school as concerning gender, sexuality, and those sorts of issues. And if under the Sex Discrimination Act, if a school would say, well, because of what you believe about sexuality and gender, or because of the way that you're living out what you believe about sexuality or gender, we don't want to employ you because you don't reflect the faith of our school, that would be discrimination. But there are exemptions that protect all faith-based organisations, including schools, from that. The Greens have said explicitly they want to get rid of those protections. They keep talking about removing discrimination against LGBTIQ people in employment in religious organisations, which is code for saying religious organisations can't expect people to live out their faith in those areas. So that's one of the worst case scenarios. It's not just a Labor victory. I mean, Labor's been in power for 3 years, but it's a Labor victory in minority, reliant on the Greens, and having not made any commitments to. The other nightmare scenario, if Labor wins despite a heavy campaign against them from faith-based advocacy organisations, because this is something that we saw particularly in Victoria, and if religious organisations come out and say we're against Labor, Labor is a threat, Labor is a problem, and Labor wins, then Labor's going to turn around and say, well, you guys are the opposition, you guys are the enemy, you guys, why are we interested in what you're saying? I don't think that's anywhere near as likely at the federal level, but that's the other nightmare scenario. In somehow, some way, the way that the Christian community acts makes Labor think that we are their enemy, and so therefore they treat us as their enemy. So, yeah, those are the two scenarios that I think we would want very hard to avoid.
When we talk about Christian commentary on elections, this is perhaps why we would often say we're not partisan. Happy to call out what's happening on both sides. I often say, well, when we're saying not partisan, happy to put the boot in both sides. In other words, when there are bad things on either side, the Christians need to be able to call those things out. Let me ask you, though, when you say making a commitment, now just a minute and a half out to news, people might be asking, well, how do those parties make some sort of explicit statement, commitment to religious freedom or any other freedoms before an election like this? I'm thinking lobby groups and things like that, but what are your thoughts here, quickly?
Well, the possibility of 65 candidate forums, 70, 80 candidate forums in churches across Australia is a great motivation to make commitments. But leading up to the last election, Labor did make a written commitment about what they were going to do about faith-based schools. It wasn't super strong, but they did stick to it. And even when pushes were made to undermine faith-based schools, Anthony Albanese resisted those pushes. So even a soft commitment can actually be a very valuable tool. And they'll just release a press release so that then their candidates can say things at these candidate forums, say, oh, no, we've promised that we won't do that. See, this is Anthony Albanese's promise.
Mike, while we're just waiting for another listener input, let's talk about these Meet the Candidate forums. You say there's 80 of these already confirmed, already in place, all around Australia. 80 of those, and is there still room for people to say, well, I don't know why my church is not doing this. We should have one of these in our church. Should have a Meet the Candidate forum. Is this possible?
Absolutely. Would love to talk to anybody who is keen to hold a candidate forum. We've got, as you said, we've got lots of these forums, closer to 70 of these forums around Australia. But there's 150 electorates in Australia, so that still leaves well over 80, 90 forums that I can't do maths, that we need to get a event in. So I'd love to talk to any church that's interested. You can email us at info@freedomforfaith.org.au.
Okay, info@freedomforfaith.org.au. As you say, 150 electorates. You've got 70 to 80 confirmed around Australia. There's plenty room for more. Is there room for more than one in each electorate? I mean, you know, you might have two. You might have the Presbyterian Church on one corner saying we're doing a Meet the Candidate forum. You might have the Anglican Church on the other corner saying we're doing a Meet the Candidate forum. Is there room for multiple churches doing multiple forums?
During election time, there are a lot of demands on an MP. and running 2 different nights for them to see half the Christian population at each time, it would probably not be the right strategy. There might be a couple of electorates that are just so big that you want to do one at each end. But instead, what we suggest is that, I know, shock horror, but the Anglicans and the Presbyterians might want to work together and even live stream it in a larger electorate so that people across the electorate can either watch it live or watch it later on. And that's in fact what most cases is happening, is that a central church is going to hold the forum, invite all the churches in the area to send their people, and then live stream it for people who can't make it.
Mike, does it depend on the pastor or the priest to be able to get one of these things going? Or is it typically the sort of person who says, we need to do something and we need to have those candidates come to our church and answer the questions we've got? Is it somebody who's politically active in church that can actually set these things up?
It's a bit of both. I mean, you can't do it without support of the senior minister. But the person who can bring it to the senior minister, say, I've heard about this, I think it's a really good idea, I'll help you do it, that's a really valuable person in the church. And in most churches, a smart senior minister always says, oh, that's a great idea, why don't you go do it? So, but we do need the senior minister's backing, and we need their involvement, and we really do want the involvement of all the churches in the area. The church, in the end, is the one who runs these forums, but Freedom for Faith helps. We've got frameworks, how-to guides, everything we need to make it as easy as possible. It's about as easy to run a forum as it is to run a normal church service.
Okay, and there's an old saying comes into my mind. Great initiatives always come best attached to a volunteer. So
yes.
If you're thinking of being a critic of your local church for not having one of these forums, it might be because there needs to be some impetus behind that, and that might come with your volunteerism, or somebody in church who's well connected, perhaps across a number of churches in your community, a number of churches throughout the electorate, to coordinate something and make it happen. Now, because the election hasn't been called yet, and the most likely date, as we were talking a little earlier, the 17th of May, there's a little bit of time to do this. How much time does it take to organise one of these, Mike?
Well, you want to be starting to send out invitations to candidates in the next few weeks. I'd say we've got about three to 4 weeks to decide finally if churches want to be involved. The longer it takes to decide, the later it gets, the harder it might get to pin the candidates down on a date. But we're recommending that the dates that we hold these forums are after the school holidays, so the last couple of weeks of April, the first week of May is a great time to be holding these forums. So there's still plenty of time to chat with your senior minister, ask them if it's a good idea. We've got information about what the forums look like, how they run, a 2-page handout to give to your minister and parish council and people like that. And we've got a couple of weeks to decide to get something going.
Special honour to you, Mike, and your team at Freedom for Faith, because oftentimes when we talk about elections, there's fabulous groups like the Australian Christian Lobby, done lots of these sorts of meet the candidate forums, but you have been able to activate and mobilise the church. Perhaps at no other time has it been this mobilised because of the good work that your team is doing. So special honour to you for that. And while you've got 80, I'm going to be hoping, and let me say, let's turn that into a prayer, that there'll be 160. Let's double that sort of number for a possibility here, that there might be 160 of these Meet the Candidate forums around the nation. Exciting stuff. There's another initiative that you've got going, because as we were talking in the first part of our conversation, saying that neither of the major parties have any commitment at all to the freedoms that we are talking about today. But you've got another initiative that may well change that and bring something to fruition before the election is held and before we know what the next parliament's going to look like. A petition. Tell us about this petition.
Oh, this is a petition to Anthony Albanese and to Peter Dutton, asking them to make a clear commitment leading up to the election for religious freedom. And it's got some specific wording about the individual rights to religious freedom and the positive rights for faith-based organisations, including schools, to operate according to their faith. And it's asking for the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition to commit. And indeed, just as we speak, that petition has gone live on our website.
Okay, the petition is live, and you can access that petition. And I'll encourage listeners to go to the freedomforfaith.org.au website and read the details there. And if you feel like signing it, my encouragement to sign that, because going live now and requesting commitment from both sides to commit to policy around religious freedom, which means a promise to have religious freedom. Now, I'm just thinking, even as we're talking about this, Mike, some will be saying, well, what do I care about religious freedom? As long as I've got the choice to be able to send my kids to whatever school I want to send them to, and those sorts of things around schools. And schools is good. It's much more broad than just schools, but schools is a great way to understand what the threat is, isn't it? So let's come back to schools for a moment. And you're a parent, you've got children of school age, maybe you can't afford to send your kids to a Christian school. That might be a big issue that you might have, but you want the choice to be able to send your kids to a Christian school if you can. Is this one of the things that's actually under threat?
Well, absolutely. What's under threat is the ability for a Christian school to stay Christian. Many schools choose to only employ Christian teachers, Christian staff, Christian office workers, Christian groundskeepers, because they want to create that fundamentally Christian community. Other schools choose to have a critical mass and say our senior staff are all going to be Christian. We'll make sure that there's a large number of Christians throughout our community. And then we will have other staff members who aren't Christian, but also are not going to be undermining what it is that we're teaching about the Christian faith. So both sets of those schools need to be able to look at an employee and say, well, are you going to fit in with our Christian ethos? Are you either actively living it out in the case of some schools, or are you not going to undermine it and so allow the school to be unified and operating under our Christian faith? But that does, unfortunately, mean discerning at the point of employment and throughout employment. Is this person's life, is this person's teaching, is what they believe, is what they say, actually reflecting what we believe? And then, of course, the real conflict does come down on the issues of gender and sexuality and those sorts of issues. When a school has beliefs about them out of the Bible, this is how I believe that sexuality works, this is how I believe that gender works, and then an employee is not living that, is very clearly not living that in some cases, the school needs to be able to act. And it's that ability to act which is coming under threat, particularly from policies from the Greens, but also, I have to say, from the left wing of both the Labor and the Liberal Party. Both parties have got social progressives who think that schools should not be able to, quote, discriminate in this way.
Okay, so it does clarify, doesn't it? What's at threat, and using the schools as an example here, because as a Christian you might say, I believe in a monogamous, heterosexual, male-female marriage for a lifelong commitment to the raising of children with those values, which are godly values and are pro-family. So we're talking about that, which people can access right now when they send their children to Christian schools. Now, that's a very generalised thing. I know some people have got some problems with what Christian schools are teaching too, but the alternative is the LGBT-driven relationships agenda. All of the sorts of things that people have been hearing us talking about on this program that are contrary to a biblical foundation for relationships and family, your children will be under that scenario if there is no commitment to this level of religious freedom. Is that a fair enough way of putting it, Mike?
Yeah, what is going on in this sort of threat is it's an undermining of pluralism. Pluralism basically says you don't have to agree with me, and I don't have to agree with you. So there are going to be schools, they're going to push one view of gender and sexuality that matches the general LGBTIQ worldview, and that's fine that those schools exist. There will be other schools that are fundamentally Christian and teach a Christian view of sexuality, and it's fine that they exist. and parents get to choose. There will also be schools that are run by Muslims, and there will be Buddhist schools, and that's the ability to choose, that each community gets to live out what they believe without interference by the other communities. That's the fundamental thing that we're trying to protect. So it's not even just religious freedom that we're looking for. It's freedom, as you said at the start, freedom of conscience, freedom of association, just to come together with people who agree with you, whether it's because you're a Christian or whether it's because you're an environmentalist or a Liberal Party member or a Labor Party member. We should be able to meet in organisations that hold to a set of beliefs.
So religious freedom. And in the scenario of taking away your ability to choose what you would like to have your children taught when they are sent to school, that's going to be an important way of just clarifying what it means and what is at risk if you don't get these sorts of things right. Just to mention that petition, it has gone live and it's requesting a commitment from both sides to commit to religious freedom. Come back to the Meet the Candidate forums for a few moments here, Mike. You've got 80 of these planned around Australia. I've said let's get ambitious. There might be some listeners who are thinking, well, I can contribute to that. Our church should have one of those. I've said let's have 160 of those, but that's going to mean there's got to be a major uprising of people contacting you and saying, how do I run one of these Meet the Candidate forums, Mike? And you can furnish them with all the details. But let me ask you, because there's been some state-based concerns, controversy around whether the major parties are even going to support these faith-based Meet the Candidate forums. There was controversy in the state of Queensland, and that may not have overflowed to other areas. Has there been sort of any special commitments to you that might lead you to think that there's no boycott likely?
Yes, but to speak about the boycotts, in Queensland, the Liberal Party chose not to turn up to most of the forums, and that was around the abortion debate, and we saw how David Christofouli handled that. In WA, interestingly, it was the Labor Party who chose not to turn up to any of our forums. However, at the federal level, we've been working very closely with both Mr Albanese and Mr Dutton's offices, with senior staffers on both sides who are well aware of what we're doing and well aware of how many of these forums we have, and there are many of them in very, very marginal seats. Encouragingly, we have got RSVPs already from a number of MPs from both sides. We've got RSVPs from Nats and Libs and Labor and Independents. I think we may even have one from a Green. So there doesn't seem to be any nationwide embargo on these. And I think partly it's just recognition of how marginal this election will be. Every vote absolutely matters in this election, and particularly in all the marginal seats, particularly in New South Wales, in Queensland, in Western Australia, and some of them in Victoria as well, lots in Victoria. Those seats, 200, 300 votes could well make the difference between who's going to make government. And so they're going to They really understand that these forums are a good opportunity to meet with a particular demographic, a group of people who normally they don't get to talk to. It's hard to find Christians and hear what Christian issues are, but if you fill a room with Christians, the politicians will come and talk to us.
And so taking advantage of the opportunity to eyeball the politician, even talk to them afterwards, shake their hand, and courteously, face-to-face, express your expectations. Hey, I'm glad to hear that's a breath of fresh air that there are commitments from both sides to attend these sorts of forums, and there might be some boycotts in some areas, and who knows how that might develop, because there's been concerns, of course, with a lot of the Christian organisations that have held surveys over the years. Now, I'm talking about organisations like the Australian Christian Lobby and Family Voice Australia. You've got the Australian Christian Values Checklist, and they create all sorts of good ways, resources for people to be able to vote. When those organisations are getting a cold shoulder from various parties, it's almost as though they are making their own statement about what the Christians really believe in all of these different policy debates. If you've got candidates that don't turn up to your forum, is that in itself making as big a statement as if they do?
Oh, absolutely. It could be in a very safe seat. They don't turn up to their forum because it's a safe seat. I don't need your votes and I don't really care. And sometimes you're talking about, we have sent an invitation in the electorate of Grandler to the member for Grandler, who happens to also be the Prime Minister. He may turn up, he may not turn up. That would be less of a statement, being a very, very busy man. But when a backbencher decides they're not going to turn up to one of these, it's very hard to take that as anything other than, I don't think I need your vote. Or in some cases, I think I've already got your vote, so I don't need to bother talking to you.
Is anybody feeding back to you the sorts of responses that are given when those candidates are on stage and you've got the people there sitting in the audience and they're firing questions, and, people might be thinking right now, who prepares those questions, but who's recording what those question responses are and feeding them back so that others can see what those candidates stand for?
That's the magic of live streaming. And so even today, you can go back and watch the live streamed recordings of the candidate forums that we ran in New South Wales for the 2023 election. When you live stream something, it's up there on YouTube forever, and you can go back and watch it. So this is why we really do encourage churches to be live streaming, not just for people who can't make it physically, but it means the next 2 weeks, 3 weeks leading up to the election, people can go back and watch. But even better, after the election, we can go back to that video and say, Mr. Candidate, Mrs. Candidate, you made this commitment when you were in front of us. Now we're asking you to hold to that commitment.
My mind is running wild with good thoughts on how you can really maximise this, as you say, because there's a live stream, it's being recorded. If you get your Meet the Candidate forum going early, then you can actually advertise. Supposing you're in a smaller country town, there's a local newspaper, you've done your Meet the Candidate forum, you've got the recording, it's up online, simply an ad in the newspaper or pass the word around. This is what the candidates all said. So really, you've got maximising the opportunity, because when you've got that recorded, others can go and see what those responses were, even though they didn't get to the actual event. Hey, come back to Meet the Candidate forums and how you actually get one of those underway. For listeners, someone's listening right now saying, we need one of these in our church, in our town, in our electorate. How do I get that going? Take us through that just one more time for listeners to connect with Freedom for Faith today.
Or you can send me an email at info@freedomforfaith.org.au, or you could read more about the forums at freedomforfaith.org.au/forums, or you'll find a link on our homepage while you're looking for the petition as well, so you can sign the petition. But send us an email and we'll talk to you about what the next steps are. The process is fairly easy. Let's send out an invite to the candidate. Let's get them locked down. Let's send out some invites to the churches. And we've got a full how-to guide about how to run the night, step by step. What questions to ask. We do have some recommended initial questions that have been written by a combined group of faith leaders from across Australia. And then you take questions from the audience. And that's the night. It's actually quite easy. Ask a question, get some answers, move on to the next question, pray, thank the candidates, and then, as you said, let them hang around afterwards, shake people's hands, talk to people and get a feel for the people that they've just been meeting with.
And that's going to be somewhat of a relief for some listeners today saying, well, what questions do I ask? Well, when you've got a set list of questions formulated by the leaders of our denominational churches, then opportunity for people to ask questions from the floor, that really creates the opportunity to be able to get a great assessment of what's going on in your local electorate. Mike Southon is the Executive Director of Freedom for Faith, activating the church to defend religious freedom. You might have heard me complimenting Mike and his team at Freedom for Faith for doing such an amazing job mobilising churches all over Australia. 80 of those all ready to go. Those Meet the Candidate forums, and your church might be on that list too. Why don't you connect with Mike? freedomforfaith.org.au. He mentioned you can email him direct to info@freedomforfaith.org.au. Just great getting your insights as always, Mike Southon, and no doubt we'll be talking some more through the election as things develop, but certainly all the best and God's richest blessing as you, pulling the strings from your office there, and I think you're based in Sydney, and there's going to be these forums happening all over Australia. Thank you so much for letting our listeners in on those today. And just one more quick one, that petition is now live, and the petition is requesting commitment from both sides to commit to religious freedom. Why don't you go and visit that website, freedomforfaith.org.au, and respond on that petition as well. Mike, thanks so much for sharing your insights with us today on 2020.
Thanks, Neil. It's always a great pleasure.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.